equally, they cause problems to China. In terms of the Humphrey was a comment, I think that would be wonderful. I think we're seeing the reaction at the, what do we call it, the hard, the non-values, the less inspirational level. We are seeing that because of the increase in OPEC out of the US, for example, in infrastructure spending. Certainly this added competition, in a sense, has got Japanese infrastructure investment going up. So it has brought forth more competition to say we're going to come in with alternative things. It's brought some competition in terms of partnering. But the values articulation, I don't think has been as strong. And I touched on the Pompeo speech around Africa, which was much more around, gosh, the Chinese are bad, why would you do that? Stay away from the Chinese, you follow us. Rather than, this is why we're attractive, and we'll help work through that.
Oh, just real quick. Japan has come up with a high-quality investment plan. That's the problem. It's expensive. So Europe is terrible at advertising what they do. They have almost no interest loans. So these projects in Europe shouldn't be paid. Someone should take a loan from China. They can get the funding from the EU. So I'll just speak about the European experience, but the Europeans are terrible at advertising. China has a train come to London. You move to London, they have it on the front page of the newspaper. Everyone's like, whoa, and that route's like 100 years old. And everyone's just like, wow, look what the Chinese have done. So the Chinese are genius. They're really brilliant, and they are very good at marketing what they do. And then, they build in Africa, where they have missed out, and where Europeans have really missed the boat, is what's happened in Africa. The Europeans could no longer compete with China's loans because Europeans had all these rules. Lots of strings attached, good governance, all these things that are thorny and difficult to. But now Africa is becoming so difficult for China to do business in, exactly because they have no strings attached. So maybe they're learning by doing, and this will change over time. And the last thing, they build in Africa the same way they build in China.
Notorious to, with all due respect, not be as transparent as we expect. I understand the debt to GDP is more than 100%. The local banks in China, not the policy banks like China Development Bank and all the others, have massive amount of non-performing loans. The government's program is to move away from investment to consumption, so encourage savings. And the general working population is growing, is slowing down as far as the work. So there are internal matters within China that need to be addressed. The reason I say moratorium is that I am actually from Pakistan and I have a project under the CPEC as part of the bilateral. And we have come to see that we've been with a very fortunate few to have actually had access to that funding. But the next phase of funding is slowing down simply to address the very thing that you have, ladies and gentlemen, laid out. The legal aspect of it, the socio-economic development side of it, people to people.
2-minute mark. Could you
beg your pardon. My question is the impact of China itself on Belt and Road, whether you also foresee a moratorium on major investments coming forward.
Excellent question. Thank you, sir. And then this lady here with her hand up, and Deb Chapman.
Emily Mansfield, The Economist Intelligence Unit. I guess this follows on nicely from the last question. I'm also interested in the outlook for the Belt and Road, in particular in the 16+1 that Teresa had mentioned. Obviously, there's concern in those countries about whether these projects are going well, whether this is the best way to get the funding that they would like. Will they turn back towards the EU, or is there still potential perhaps for the kind of constructive pushback that Andrew was speaking about to perhaps make this a more productive way of moving forwards?
Hi, I'm Charlie Parton from RUSI. In terms of positive pushback, Xi Jinping's been waging war on corruption internally. He's done, as far as I can see, very little to do anything about corruption externally. What's come out recently has been quite a lot about Chinese companies bribing. We have the UK Bribery Act. What can we do to encourage the Chinese to level that particular playing field? And therefore, diminish the disadvantage of the countries which are, some of whose leaders and others have taken these bribes?
So perhaps we can start with Andrew, and we can go.
Sure. Just starting off on China's current position, and as a lot of people say in lots of forums, Chinese domestic situation drives so much of what is happening externally, and that is equally true for Belt and Road. And yes, without going into long detail, there are a lot of domestic challenges at the moment, both short-term and mid-term, around the strength of the economy. And in fact, that's a lot of, when people talk about the very big numbers for Belt and Road investment, it's generally seen that that's not something China can do as it is at the moment. It doesn't have enough money to do that. And that's why we then talk about this potential opening up and partnering. The question is whether that will really happen or not. So to the question about how does Belt and Road look going forward, I am also struck, by the way, before I get to that there is often this initial comment, well, China's entrapping people with debt and there's too much lending going on. And then the next thing that happens is we have a lot of countries now quite disappointed that China's not turned up with lots of money and it's not fulfilling the expectations. So there is a bit of a, whatever happens, it's people are not feeling good about it. I think, though, at core, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, people and governments are getting much more focused on what actually is this here. This is an offer from somebody, from the Chinese side versus the American side or the European side, to lend some money to build something, and we're going to bring our guys to come and do it. It's very tangible. There's this overarching stuff. But should I do this project? Is it attractive? And I think the answer will be some of it will happen, some of it won't. A lot more private sector stuff than state-owned stuff. And it will depend upon the ability and willingness of the Chinese to respond to this pushback and say there's a better offer on the table. So that's how I would see the outlook. I think the point Charlie Parton made about bribery and corruption is very important. And maybe from some of the countries where this is now being put in the spotlight, I mean, Malaysia has been extensively reported, less globally reported, the Kyrgyz topic I looked at a while back. Having a discussion with the Chinese about, look, this doesn't work for you guys, it doesn't work for the country it's happening in, and it's not in line with the values and standards that we have. So there is, to use the wonderful phrase, win-win there for people, because that is not threatening to Xi Jinping's authoritarianism. And it's completely in line with his agenda, but it also brings benefits for countries working on Belt and Road.
Okay. We sometimes say, when the Chinese say win-win, they win twice. So to answer Emily Mansfield's question, I'll try my best. This whole thing about 16+1, there has been a change in investment patterns in Europe, so the Chinese are very interested in high tech. So they're not really going to Central and Eastern Europe, they're going to Germany or France or UK. So that's the key thing. So there's this promise fatigue, it has never materialized, and they're very disappointed. They're angry with China for not doing that. So they are holding out, though. It's like this preemptive obedience, like maybe if we write this statement, to show that we support your views, you'll give us some more investment. So it took only a little bit of investment to get this preemptive obedience. And Hungary is a very complex country because of Orban. And it's also signaling that we have other options. Orban is a he's got Russia, he's got China, he's got, he's all these other countries he can turn to. So he's kind of signaling to Brussels that we've got options. So I think that is a very complex situation. And then learning experiences. I mean, China, they're learning, and they always get better. They look at what they did wrong, and then they improve, and then they have these incredible feedback loops. So, for example, when a Chinese business won a bid for building a road in Poland for this big football match, it was a disaster because it just didn't finish on time, and the Chinese were going to lose face because it was a big match. And they assumed they could bring in Chinese workers. No, they couldn't because of the labor laws in Europe. Second, they didn't know what a frog tunnel was. Do you know what a frog tunnel is? Okay, you had to build a tunnel under the road so the frogs can cross. And the Chinese didn't know what this was, and they were very confused. So, it just failed miserably. So they lost the project, but they learned, and next time they'll know. So it's always a steep learning curve. Oh, and then finally, hyperbole. There's a lot of infrastructure diplomacy going on. And I mean, there's a huge gap. And if China, they're brilliant. I mean, they're like, hey, you know, we'll build the road. And it's a great, powerful narrative. And no other country in the world has that narrative right now. So China's got a very good story.
There are actually fog tunnels in China. Just to Charlie's question, it is illegal to offer bribes to foreign officials under Chinese criminal code, but there's to date not been a prosecution for that. But I do think we need to be careful about what we wish for, because obviously, you know, we have the UK Bribery Act in the UK. There's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, and that is something that is actually of great concern to China. They are not at all happy with. China isn't happy at all with the extent of US laws and their extraterritoriality and their very long reach of jurisdiction. So do we want to encourage China to go in that direction by having a similar law? We're already seeing that to an extent, and obviously, Charlie, you know better than I, the National Supervisory Commission does give China reach over its state-owned enterprises and other public officials overseas, and they would prefer to handle that through a extra-legal, party-led method. So I think it is quite important. It's quite a difficult one for us to work out how we effectively engage on that, because obviously we do want to see a reduction in corruption and bribery, but going through some of the traditional channels don't work. And I think what I would like to see happen is working more with China through some of the existing international frameworks, both some of the very well-known ones, you know, through the OECD and UNCAC, but also through some of the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that the US left and has significantly weakened. But actually, maybe we do need to relook at some of those existing mechanisms that we had and make it more closely aligned with our values, you know, where it is civil society and states working together in those initiatives. And I would just end with as well, actually there is still quite a big push in China to look at, within the academic community, about how they support anti-corruption initiatives that aren't necessarily engaging directly with the party-led methods, and so that's focusing on the private sector. But in my experience of that so far, a lot of it has also looked at using surveillance technology to utilize that. So I had one person from a very high-profile Chinese e-commerce company say, you know, we just track facial recognition, and if somebody's eyebrow raises in a certain way, it might look like they're doing something a bit dodgy, and so we fire them and blacklist them through every other e-commerce company in China as well. So I think we also just need to be very careful about what we mean by our own. So I am being a little bit facetious there, but we do need to be quite careful, I think, about what our values are and how that drives our discussion around anti-corruption, as well as the results that we want to see.
So, do we have time for any more or one more? Oh, I'm gonna offend somebody. I know I am. Listen, we've not had many women ask questions. Would anyone, a lady in the audience, have a question to? Because we've had mostly all you chaps, and you're well done. But or shall we? I mean, this gentleman here, I think, with his hand up, who's kind of patient, and I do apologize. This gentleman was missing up, but we can. I know that everyone's desperate for tea and coffee.
Thank you. John Elliott, journalist and author, lived in India for 25 years. Can I take you back to Humphrey Hawksley's question? If only because he and I have been debating this in recent weeks and you didn't answer it. Is it naive to think that countries from Canada to the UK to Japan could come together to produce, to set up and propose a combined BRI, so that countries around the world have an option when presented with a Chinese offer to turn to something from the West? I won't tell you which of us thinks it's naive and which of us doesn't.
No, that's fine. I think, can I ask each person just maybe a minute or a little bit, just to summarize? I think that's a great question to go out on, is what is the Western response in the legal, economic, political, how can we respond? So if you could, each of you, say your final remarks to the crowd on that. I think it's quite a good one.
I don't think it's naive to answer the direct answer to the formulation of the question.
I think it's a bit of a stretch. I do think we've got a much clearer view over the past year, or a clearer view is spreading out about what this is and what it's not. And the elements of providing a compelling proposition to countries, to government leaders, businesses in different parts of the world from, in inverted commas, the West, and come back to your question around countries working together. I don't think it's one country alone. I think it has a lot of merit. I think it needs to be a compelling, attractive proposition, and we've lost some of that buzz or momentum, or whatever the right word is, around that in the past few years. As Theresa was saying, the narrative is very much with China at the moment, and there needs to be another narrative, as well as analysis and concern.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, you're a good journalist because you push hard on that question. All right, so Japan has this high quality, but it can't go as far. China has very deep pockets, but those pockets are getting less deep. I mean, they have the economy slowing down, and there's the Quad, which is in response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the Quad, the quadrilateral, is Australia. I mean, it's an idea that existed before, but it's been rejuvenated again, I guess, in order to respond to China's China Dream. So it's Australia, India, the US, and Japan. And so in this Quad framework, they're talking about making kind of structural loans, but it's all very weak, and it's not much of a response at all. And that's the issue. No one has the kind of money. Now the EU is stepping up. They're coming up with the Central Asia strategy, and I've seen, or I've heard, Helge Schmidt say it's 60 billion, and it will be magnified by 10% with private sector investment. Now, I don't know who in the private sector would want to invest in those areas. It's very risky, but we'll see. Hopefully she's correct. And that's why everyone's turning to China. It's hard to compete, and in this classic narrative, you get the small countries try to play the big powers off each other and say, well, he'll give me this, what are you going to give me? So this is, what's happened for centuries, and China's there, and I think they're very good at publicizing it, but there's past things that I think Europe, the US should actually highlight, because it shouldn't just be a blank slate, and China does everything now. So I think that there have been some good infrastructure projects in the past. And another thing is, China gets World Bank funds. I think it's time to graduate China and maybe use those World Bank funds to another developing economy.
Cheeky chairman, after all, who raised China, if not the West?
I think was it Wen Jiabao who said to a Western leader, get your own house in order first. I can't remember if it was after the global financial crisis or the London riots or something. But I do actually think that we do need to look quite seriously when we look at our own argument around values and what is wrong with our offer. We do have huge gaps in our own ability to invest. But I think that actually a lot of our difficulty in building strong relationships at the moment does come down to our own questioning of and insecurities around what our systems stand for and what our strengths are.
So a great many thanks to the Democracy Forum for hosting us, and a great many thanks to our speakers.
Did you say tea and coffee?
Oh yes, tea and coffee are outside in the lobby. Please make your way there, and we'll start in about 15 minutes.
So is that one?
Yes.
Editor of Asian Affairs magazine, and I also write a weekly blog about Japan called Japan Story. I've been writing about Asian issues for many years, and I'm convinced that there's nothing more currently significant than the subject that we're talking about today. And that's because the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the most divisive subjects in Asia. China, as we've been hearing, is very keen to present the Belt and Road Initiative as a series of win-win deals, and it's keen to draw attention to all the countries and organisations which support it, more than 80 in all. But there are some significant sceptics, India being one and Japan being another. In the case of India, I think that creates danger, because if the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping can't agree on the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a risk of simmering tension on the border. And the Americans have warned that that could escalate into armed conflict. Japan and China are long-standing rivals with their own distinctly different ideas about politics and trade. I'm pleased to say that this year the diplomatic relationship between Japan and China is improving significantly, and we'll see a visit by President Xi to Tokyo to meet the Emperor in a few months' time. But nevertheless, there are big differences in the way that the Belt and Road Initiative is perceived within Asia, and as we were hearing on the earlier panel, there's also a lot of scepticism within Europe. So I'm very pleased that today we have already been able to ask some profound questions as a result of the stimulating presentations of our first panel. And what better place to go a little bit deeper into this subject than by looking at it through the perspective of Pakistan. Now, I don't know whether any of you came here on a double-decker bus today, but if you were in London last week, you might have been rather struck to see advertisements on many double-decker buses talking about the benefits of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The side of a double-decker bus is not really the place to put a PhD thesis, but it did send a message. It said that the Gwadar project in Pakistan has the potential to rival Dubai. Well, I was in discussion the other day about this with a Pakistan journalist, and he made the point that Pakistan is not, generally speaking, the destination of choice for investment. He described the country as a conflict zone, barely emerging from terrorism. And he drew my attention to the very large number of people who still sadly risk their lives in trying to escape from Pakistan and to start a new life in Europe and in Great Britain. Well, given those challenges, China is taking a very bold approach to its investments in Pakistan. And I wonder, what real benefits will that bring to the citizens of that country? What about jobs? Will the Chinese bring their own staff in to build new ports and infrastructure projects, or will they create jobs amongst the Pakistanis? I'm sure you're going to enjoy listening to all the speakers in this session, and I'd like you to think of some questions that you'd like to put to them at the end, because one of the great things about today's meeting is that we have a range of expertise with a great deal of interesting perspectives, both from the European side and from the Asian side. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to hear your points of view, and you'll be able to put your points to the panel and get them to go a little bit deeper into some of their ideas. But let me say something about Dr. Pervez Hudbhoy. His background is in science, and he specialises in nuclear issues, but he combines this research with writing on the areas that we're thinking about today: politics, international relations, and social development. So I hope, Dr. Hudbhoy, that your visit here to the University of London will be a rewarding one. I'm sure we'll do our best to engage with your words today. My expectation is that there'll be many questions, and I look forward to the discussion about BRI following on from your presentation. But ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Pervez Hudbhoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Democracy Forum, for inviting me here. At the very outset, I must be quite frank and say that in the last session, we did hear essentially an expression of Western perceptions of the Belt Road Initiative. There was much suspicion that was articulated, some of which I share, but the reason that was given was one that I cannot totally subscribe to. It was said that Chinese values are not Enlightenment values, and Enlightenment values are universal values. Well, let's accept that provisionally, that Enlightenment values are indeed universal values, but then the question becomes, how often has the West been true to those values? Indeed, let us remember that the age of colonialism happened precisely during that epoch. So, about 300 years ago, the British East India Company, it was called the Honourable British East India Company in those days. The Honourable was dropped after a while. It made friends with the Mughal emperors, and it made slow inroads. It eventually ended up destroying the Mughal Empire, and in 1857, India became British India. Well, we don't want that to happen, and we certainly don't want a repetition of colonialism, even economic colonialism. But now let me get back to the point, which is the Belt Road Initiative. It originates from China's desire to export its surplus capacity. Surplus capacity in terms of production of iron, steel, electronics, and so much more. Now, this is precisely what Vladimir Lenin had talked about as being the he talked about imperialism as being the highest stage of capitalism, that when capitalism produces more than it can consume, then it looks for markets overseas, and so therefore there is a legitimate reason to be suspicious. Well, this is a huge, huge plan. Its total budget is about 12 times that of the Marshall Plan, which was at the end of World War II, and it could essentially reshape the contours of the world, at least the economic contours of the world. I think that it is something that we must come to terms with, because the Belt Road Initiative is really a consequence of globalization, and globalization is itself a consequence of technology. Nothing of this kind would have been possible 300 years ago. But now that technology exists, it will be used by countries, and countries which are more powerful will be able to assert themselves in the international arena. Now, China has made clear, it has asserted that its relationship, its involvement with partner countries will be purely on an economic basis, that it does not it refutes economic colonialism. It states that political ideology, whether you have democracy or no democracy, human rights or no human rights, doesn't matter. That it shall look for only economic viability. So this is a criterion that we must evaluate it on. This claim needs to be evaluated. China also says that that BRI will build local capacity, and it will help sustainable development in the countries with which it has chosen to partner. I propose to look at this in the context of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is all of politics today in Pakistan. It's the big thing in town. By local capacity, I will mean that the ability of local industry to participate and to produce and manufacture goods that can be sold either domestically or internationally, and which add high value. And by sustainable development, I'll mean that which can lead to a planet which is able to come to terms with resource utilization. So, I am sure many of you know that the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, started in 2013. It has a total outlay of something like $62 billion. As such, it is the largest investment that Pakistan has seen in 70 years. The 70 years of its existence, and it is the largest investment by China. And indeed, there are very great expectations. Now, I plan to evaluate this on these two items alone. We can talk about other geopolitical, geostrategic issues that might be involved, but let's look at these two. But having said that, I must say that I cannot arrive at a definitive conclusion. The reason being that there's so little data to go on. Now, unfortunately, or maybe this is the way things are, very little actual detail has been revealed about the terms of CPEC. We do not know. I, as a Pakistani citizen living in Pakistan, wanting to know, asking around, looking at newspapers, going through the internet, wherever, cannot find out where this investment has been put in, at what, under what conditions, what has been the outcome. And so there is only anecdotal evidence of what has actually happened. This lack of transparency is in fact so serious that the State Bank of Pakistan formally requested the government of Pakistan to reveal the details under which China has given loans or entered into contracts with the government. And to my knowledge, that query has as yet not been answered. So there will be considerable guessing, and that guessing then has to be on what are essentially reports in local newspapers. And what I have been reading is a lot of complaints, actually, that China brings its own employees, its own companies to execute whichever deals have been made under whatever conditions they are, and that they prefer to bring their own people. They do not hire locally. There are no advertisements in Pakistani newspapers which say that this Chinese company wants to hire so many Pakistanis or so many people of this qualification. One does see some, but they are very, very few. The exception, of course, is security. There are something like 12,000 soldiers who have been deputed to protect the Chinese, particularly in Balochistan, where they are considered to be under threat. The reason for that being a sense of deprivation of the Baloch, that although the port of Gwadar is where the central interest of China seems to lie, yet in that town, essentially the Chinese have made their own enclave, to which even entrance of locals happens only if you happen to have a card, a special identity card made for that purpose. The fact is that numerous Chinese workers have been attacked, and around 45 of them have been killed, most recently in Karachi. And so this force certainly provides employment, but this is not the kind of employment that we would really like to have in Pakistan. The Chinese companies that will be operating in the special economic zones will be essentially untaxed as a means to encouraging those zones. This has drawn complaints from the local chambers of commerce. They have held meetings on this. They have shown their resentment, and this is reported occasionally in newspapers. A second worrying point is that if one visits stores in any city of Karachi, one sees that it is flooded with Chinese goods. And one wonders what has happened to local industries. So, for example, earlier on one could find cables which were made in Gujranwala, in Gujarat, in places near Lahore, and these cables were not bad. They did have ISOs 9,000 or something like that on them. And they were widely used, but now one finds Chinese cables, one finds Chinese fans, I mean electric fans, and all the brand names that one saw earlier, like Millet fan and Park fan and others, they seem to have disappeared from the market. Similarly, all small tools and spare parts, they seem to be coming from China. This has put a lot of small businesses out of work, but perhaps what has drawn a lot of attention is that contrary to the widening of the industrial and the manufacturing base, China now seems to prefer or seriously want to make inroads into the agricultural sector. Now that's a little strange, and that's not what should be happening, because agriculture, after all, is not a very technical, it's not a high-tech kind of work. It's basically digging in the ground and the right seeds and putting in the right amount of water and so forth. And this is something that we've done for thousands of years in this part of the world. Now that the Chinese have moved in with agribusinesses and they are buying land from locals, this has sent up warning signs. So these are issues which are affecting local capacity building. They're in fact decreasing the capacity of local industries, of local manufacturing. Now, there are, of course, expectations, and some of them presumably have been realized, but as I said, data is seriously lacking, that in some areas such as smartphone assembly and interior designing and manufacture of certain kinds of parts, spare parts, etc., that there will be an enhancement of local capacity. And another area in which there has been most definitely an enhancement is that of steel, because the steel that is being used for CPEC projects is coming from the Karachi steel mill, and so this is one area where there has been a contribution. One does not know what the balance sheet on this is, but looking around, one gets the impression that it is not building up local capacity. Now let me come to sustainable development. This is actually quite worrying. As we know, the planet is in terrible condition. The fact that CO2 levels have been going up has a profound impact on the future of this planet. And one of the greatest contributors is that of coal-fired power plants. In the Tharparkar district of the province of Sindh, there is a massive coal mining project, as a result of which coal will be mined for use in power plants, and this will impact, first of all, the local environment, because coal-fired plants need a lot of water, and this is in the desert. So that means that one is essentially sucking up water and denuding the aquifer. This has already caused a migration of people out of villages in Tharparkar. But it's worse than that, because coal-fired plants, they produce ash. And that ash has to be disposed of. And where do you dispose of it? In the desert. That's a major, major problem. Similarly, in the port of Gwadar, which is really the apple of the eye for the Chinese, there is also going to be electricity generated from a coal-fired power plant. And again, the issue will be, where will that ash go? Because that's pristine area, it's beautiful, and one fears what will happen to the local ecology, to the fishermen, and so forth. But this reliance on coal is actually very worrying, because it shows that the Chinese, who have suffered the worst kind of pollution in Beijing, across China, have now resolved that they will go in for wind power, for solar, for photovoltaics, and that they will phase out the coal industry in China. And yet, this is deemed to be an industry that is worthy of export, but cannot be tolerated domestically. I might say that personally, I am even more worried about the 2 nuclear power plants that have been installed, that are being presently installed in Karachi. They began construction some 4 years ago. There's another 2 to 3 years before they're completed. But here is a situation which is worrying, because as one looks at Fukushima, what happened there in 2011, when things went out of control, Fukushima had to be evacuated. But these 2 power plants are smack within Karachi itself, a city of 22 million, and there is no chance, not a hope in hell, that you could ever evacuate Karachi. But these are issues that have received no attention from the government and, of course, from the Chinese. These are deemed to be national security issues which none may talk about. Now, let me conclude by saying that China maintains that its projects have got only to do with economics. Now, I'm sure this must be true with, in relation with certain countries, many countries perhaps, but it is not true for Pakistan. If one looks at the road that has been constructed all the way from Kashgar in China, over the Khunjarab Pass, through Balochistan, down into Gwadar, trucks have already made that journey. But those trucks take a lot of time. It's much cheaper to send those goods across by sea, from a Chinese port to wherever. And so the question is really, why develop the port of Gwadar? And here the issue seems to be strategic. After all, this is what the Russians had aspired to. This is why they had invaded Afghanistan, wanting access to the warm waters of the Arabian Sea. But the Chinese could get that without an invasion. Well, it still could be a way of benefiting both countries, but then that can only be true if the terms and conditions are laid out very, very clearly, and when the issue of how people feel when their land is used and when their resources are appropriated is also taken into account, and that is not being done. I think this was a question that was raised in the earlier session too, that the Pakistan government and essentially the Pakistan military could have handled this in a way that could have assured a much more peaceful way to develop Balochistan and Pakistan as a whole, had they listened to those people who say that really this is our land and this is something that you need our permission for, and this is something that we ought to get the right share for. Unfortunately, that seems not to have happened. So, in conclusion, CPEC CPEC could offer genuine opportunities to Pakistan, but only if handled sensitively and well. It has not been, in my opinion, handled well, sensitively. The government has been over-keen upon creating this alliance with China. It has put other considerations on the side, and the secrecy and security does not bode well for the future. Now, looking at BRI on a larger canvas, one feels a little apprehensive at this vigorous globalization that is happening. It's happening without an adequate regulatory framework. Now, I certainly do not fault China alone for the state of the planet that we are in today. Let's remember that it was Donald Trump who walked out of the Paris Climate Accord. Nevertheless, there is a mounting urgency for all of us to consume less, to be discretionary in the use of resources, and we must learn that the first industrial revolution gave us the first inkling that that there could be downsides to economic expansion. So the BRI, unless it is tempered, well, if it is tempered, it can certainly bring greater prosperity to the region and to the world as a whole, but it needs to be put into a regulatory framework. That's a framework which we must work upon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation because we had an objective overview, but you drew our attention to, I think, a number of very key points, which we just heard a little bit about in the first session, and then we may be able to go deeper in this. A lack of information, a lack of transparency, unreliable data, unanswered questions. That was what I was hearing from somebody within Pakistan who's made a real effort to try to get that information and to study it and to share it with us, still finding it difficult to find out really where the money's going and what the political implications of the relationship are. And the other thing that you just began to talk about in that final section was the question of environment and security. And I'll be very interested when we come to the Q&A session to hear the perspectives of people both from Pakistan and from India on that, because I think that's very crucial to trying to understand why the resistance to BRI is markedly stronger in India than it is really in anywhere else in the whole of Asia. Important points, I think. We've talked about coming into some of the backlash against BRI, and we've heard about some of the questions that BRI asks or raises. I think that's something that we can go into a little bit more deeply now. What are the main objections? Is it about politics? Is it about economics? Is it about global influence? Is it about competition? And how is Beijing going to deal with those difficult questions, the resistance to it? We've already heard from Pervez some of the reasons which lie behind the backlash. Now let's try to find out how China deals with such a response and to ask how it's likely to tell its own version of the narrative. Would you please welcome our next speaker, Andrew Small.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for the chance to join this discussion today. So indeed, given the pushback that we've been hearing about, what I'm going to focus this presentation on is what can China change about what it's doing, what does it want to change, and what is simply the way that China does business on the BRI. And I think this matters not just intrinsically as we try to analyse what's going on, but also what it is that we're responding to now, because I don't think it's exactly the same thing. I sit in Washington, D.C. I see a lot of preparations to respond to and frame the choices around what I think of as pretty much the first iteration of the Belt and Road. I think the second iteration will, in some respects, be more challenging, and that the model we're dealing with has started to change. So stepping back initially, in many ways, the Belt and Road Initiative externalizes much of what China has been doing itself internally for a long time, and certainly in the post-financial crisis stimulus phase. If you want to look at huge, expensive infrastructure projects with questionable returns, problematic debt levels, corrupt practices, environmental problems, and so on down the list, China itself is as good a poster child for many of these things as anywhere else. But that being the case, you can also see precisely why so many on the Chinese side think that important elements of the Belt and Road Initiative are just how you do development. Because for all its obvious problems, China has generated prodigious economic growth in the last period of time while doing precisely all of these things. And the argument from the Chinese side and from the China case pretty much runs as follows. Corruption at manageable levels is not necessarily debilitating. Debt is navigable as long as it's accumulated for long-term investments, not short-term spending. Environmental damage is a normal cost for countries during their development phase. The positive externalities from, for instance, high-speed rail mean that these projects are still worth pursuing, even when many argue, as they did in China's case, for China's high-speed rail network, they don't always make economic sense. And many on the Chinese side believe that the critiques directed at China and at other developing countries are coming from countries that have forgotten their own messy histories, have been insufficiently attuned to infrastructure needs, and that China's just closer to the immediate questions and needs from countries on how you do development nowadays, more closely attuned to the priorities and interests of politicians in the developing world. And I highlight all of this because, as I say, I think there's no question that we're going into a different phase on the Belt and Road. The first phase I would kind of characterize as the move quickly and break things phase. Speed, scale, momentum, dramatic narratives, mega projects. The question now is really, what does a kind of rebalanced version of this look like? One that is better attuned to some of the critiques. And the problem that China's been dealing with is that the criticism has not just been coming from the US, Japan, and Europe, and the West. Even India, of course, you can it can write off as somewhat motivated by rivalry. The telling pushback, and the thing that has, I think, pushed more of a kind of rethinking has been the criticism that has come from countries that have been among the largest recipients of BRI investments. And since we're talking about Pakistan case, which we're obviously going to spend a certain amount of time on this panel, a country that's really supposed to be China's closest partner. And to take the criticism that you've heard in Pakistan and from the government that has just been elected, that whether they blame China or whether they blamed the PMLN government, the criticism was not transparent enough, too focused on Punjab, not enough benefit for Pakistani business, too focused on infrastructure, too close to one political party, not really a national project, not attuned enough to socio-economic needs, all of these sorts of things that you hear in various other iterations elsewhere too. When I talk to Chinese officials in these countries, and let's take the case in Islamabad, I do see a certain amount of frustration about this pushback, backlash. The view that you often hear is a kind of, you don't get it. Pakistani businesses might not like the terms for the special economic zones. Well, our business, Chinese domestic industry, didn't like it in the 80s and 90s either, but it emerged as more competitive in the end. Hurry up and do the land acquisitions. Or, look, macroeconomic issues are not our job. You need to get your act together. We'll identify investments. You need to figure out your balance of payment situation and manage your debt burden appropriately. Now, of course, there are a number of cases where there's out-and-out large-scale corruption cases, but you do also see in a number of these places instances where there's just a collision between how China thinks countries should run their business and how countries themselves think they should run their business. But however frustrated they are, the Chinese side has, of course, to work in the context that it's in, and it has to be attuned to the critiques not just from these countries, but from the bigger countries too, the Western powers and India too, if only because they can make life very difficult for China practically and reputationally unless they're at least somewhat co-opted. Now, I think China is not going to take on the criticism that we're seeing to enough of a degree as to paralyze or neuter the distinctive nature of the initiative. There's one version of a rebalanced BRI that would essentially just be that it functions like the AIIB. Virtually everyone thinks that the AIIB is shaping up to be a good bank, however you just use it. Lean, clean, green. Jin Liqun is, of course, a very charismatic and persuasive figure, and the whole thing can look like a success model. It was clearly a political coup to get all of the countries on board. I think the problem, nonetheless, with the AIIB is that it's just a bit too close to being a +1 to the existing MDBs. Most of the early AIIB projects were undertaken with the World Bank and the ADB. The scale is very modest. In some ways, the whole initiative was so smothered with love by so many other countries, not least the Europeans, that it was not really going to be an institution that could fulfill various of China's bilateral objectives. Politically directed projects, Chinese companies in privileged roles, all of these sorts of things. And as Andrew noted earlier, this is not necessarily what developing countries want either. They want a China alternative, not just another MDB or another mirror of Western financing models. I think what we'll see, therefore, and what we're already seeing, is a set of adjustments that try to blunt some of the sharpest criticism and reduce the level of antagonism associated with the BRI, while keeping much of the thrust of the initiative. Now, this version of the BRI would be pretty much in line with what a number of internal Chinese critics thought about it in the first place. And there have been a lot of internal critics of the BRI who thought that the whole thing was excessive, too much, too fast, and should proceed much more judiciously. You heard Teresa earlier on mention the One Belt, One Trap line. There were lines early on about a transnational great leap forward. These came from Chinese voices in the system before people had even heard of the Belt and Road. Now, I mean, clearly the Chinese system and all of the attitudes embedded in it are not going to change 180 degrees just because the initiative runs into some headwinds. Chinese companies and banks and officials are still going to behave in many ways the way that they have been behaving. But I think there's a few obvious ways of rebalancing that are consistent with Chinese objectives, and I think we're starting to see. So just to run through a few of them. The first obvious readjustment I think we will see with the BRI is simply a paring back on the scale of the initiative in the short to medium term. We've already seen this showing up in the overall numbers that are starting to come in for the last quarter of 2018, but you can see it in very specific cases too. Again, let's go to Pakistani case, since it was indeed the flagship initiative. The numbers, and Professor Hoopboy mentioned some of these as well, $46 billion, $60-something billion. CPEC is probably around $19 to $23 billion of actual investments that are completed or in motion, and it's going to top out at pretty much that. We may see one of the big railway lines. We'll see some other developments in the next period of time on industrial zones and a couple of other areas. But we're not going to see the huge package of MOUs and things that were talked about in the first phase. It is going to be a smaller scale result that we get there, and it's going to be a smaller scale result that we get in a number of other cases as well. You are going to see more focus on quality over quantity. You are going to see more serious attention to macroeconomic risk in some of these countries, as well as political risk. The second change I think we'll see is some degree of mitigation of the more onerous terms of some of the contracts that we saw in the first phase. The banned word is renegotiation. China doesn't like to talk about the idea that it's renegotiating these contracts. What we are seeing now is certainly renegotiation, and we were not seeing that a few years back with, say, the Sri Lanka case. We've seen some debt rescheduling. We already saw that at FOCAC, the Africa Forum. We've seen some write-downs on the more really egregiously corrupt projects. We've certainly seen that in the negotiations that are playing out in Malaysia with Mahathir. frontier. The notion of the debt trap has, of course, been extremely reputationally damaging for China, and it has affected the willingness of countries to enter into deals on certain scales. I don't think that China can politically afford many more cases like Hambantota, and financially I don't think it can afford many more cases like Venezuela. And I think in both instances there's going to be far more concern. And if you look at most of the renegotiations that have taken place on debt over the years, for the most part these are exceptions. China has functioned like a more normal creditor most of the time. The third thing is, I think you'll see more efforts to co-opt some of the third parties that have feared losing out in the context of the Belt and Road. China is aware that the criticism that is coming at BRI is also directed at the fact that in the process of externalizing the China model, you basically externalize the lack of access, privileged position of Chinese companies, all the things that the Europeans, the Americans and the Japanese and others have complained about in China itself, you externalize that to third markets. If China is able to go through a period of time in which it hands over at least a proportion of procurement contracts to, for instance, Japanese companies in Thailand, which is one of the big joint Abe-Xi initiatives, I think the expectation or the hope on China's part is that it's going to take some of the edge off the intensity of the competition. Lastly, and though there are some other changes as well, I think there's going to be a bit more of an attempt to develop a kind of more benign, out-and-out altruistic gloss to some of what's undertaken. Again, let's take the Pakistani case. The new government, of course, has come to power talking about more socio-economic development projects. You've already seen in the negotiations on the next phase the new Chinese aid agency kind of was one of the main new protagonists. There's talk of as much as $1 billion in aid that will go to Pakistan. That's not the sort of thing that China has traditionally done. Most of these projects are, of course, conceived as loans rather than grants. You may see at least a modest change in that regard. I don't think it will add up to a huge amount of money, but it will be potentially important, at least to the narrative, because this will be new, and I think China is testing out its capacities in this regard on the development side, which is not something it's traditionally done. How much difference will these and some of the other changes amount to? I do think it's going to make for a somewhat smarter version of BRI. In many ways, China's made it very easy for critics to say, here's a long list of very obvious flaws to the Belt and Road. This is why you shouldn't take Chinese money. It's a threat to your sovereignty, your democracy, your companies, your economies. Of course, this hasn't stopped governments taking the money, but it has made them think twice about the risks. And I think it has also catalyzed a far more serious range of alternative offers being provided by others. I don't think you would have seen the scale of efforts. The US Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, the Europe-Asia connectivity strategy, we both talked about earlier, the Japan's Quality Infrastructure Initiative, and a whole load of others too, without the BRI taking the problematic form that it's taken in the last few years. And I think what we've already seen, whether it's JICA financing for Bangladeshi ports, India's post-election package for the Maldives that we saw in recent weeks, World Bank recapitalization would never have happened without BRI. US agencies are at work now in trying to kind of unpick corrupt contracts and offer legal services to countries, which wasn't happening before. This is a real step change already, and I think it will go much further once some of these big private sector focused initiatives from the EU and the US actually kick into gear. They haven't really yet. There are question marks about how much capital will actually be mobilized, but there are credible estimates of several $100 billion of new financing that will come on stream for this. There was a question earlier on, is it naive to think that there could be a common response? I think there is already a huge amount of coordination now taking place on this. Teresa mentioned the Quad. When the Quad used to meet a number of years back in its previous version, most of the focus was on security. Half the time, at least, in these meetings is now spent on infrastructure. The EU and the US are talking seriously, even amid all the other differences between the two sides, about coordination between the new Europe-Asia connectivity strategy and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the challenge, as has been noted, is that with the exception of Japan, which does a lot of these things very well, some systems have not been geared up well to do infrastructure financing and things, particularly on the US side. When you you watch the grinding into gears of OPIC and the New Development Agency, USAID, and so on. This is a system challenge for countries to adjust to being able to do this stuff. There's a lot of hard work internally before they'll be able to do this well again. But I think this backdrop has already made it easier, and in some cases even advantageous, for countries to push back when they've wanted to. And it's made it easier to negotiate better terms with the Chinese than when it seemed that China really was the only game in town, which I think several years back was very much perceived to be the case. Now, if you're in, say, a certain country in the Western Balkans that wants its failing steel industry bailed out, you're still not going to get cheap EIB funding, and you may still be minded to offer a railway project to China as a quid pro quo, despite the prodigious volumes of high standard European money available, cheap European money available. But if you're an opposition party in the developing world trying to decide whether you should take a strong stance against certain BRI projects, but worried about what might happen when you take office, you're in a much more comfortable place now than you were 3 years ago. And again, if you contrast what's happened with in the Maldives or in Malaysia versus what happened with the last Sri Lankan government, I think you can see the step change that there's been just in the last few years. Very final point. I think these developments matter even before a lot of the other initiatives have really swung into motion, because I think we're sort of beyond this the crushing narrative of inevitability on the BRI that I think you had before. You had this kind of combination, even going into the Belt and Road Forum, that was China's the future, there's no alternative, you have to accept the Chinese Communist Party way of doing business, get on the bus. I remember this being deployed very forcefully towards India when it resisted its own participation in 2017. I don't think we know yet what the new model BRI is going to look like exactly. I've hinted at some of the ways that I think China's going to try to change some of this. I think a lot of it is going to emerge from many of the negotiations that are now underway, country by country right now, not just from some kind of new strategic decision from Beijing. But I do think that it is clear to China now that BRI version 1, which was pretty much, as I say, the kind of straight up externalization of the China model, is not going to work.
Thank you, Andrew. A number of interesting points there. The kickback in Malaysia, very much in the news this week. Malaysia turning down the latest BRI cooperation with China over a railway there. Sri Lanka, we mentioned in passing. Sri Lankans' politics are in a terrible mess at the moment, largely as due to political arguments over the relationship with China. Very interesting. And I think the other point that Andrew drew our attention to is that there is internal criticism within China. And I wonder how much political loss of face there would be if there is continued resistance within Asia from countries like Malaysia and Sri Lanka and India and Japan and so on, how much that would affect President Xi's reputation at a time when China is already under pressure for a lot of other reasons, not least of which is the slowdown in its rate of economic growth. So lots of questions there. One of the things that I'd like to look at next is the security implications, and obviously some of the positive ways in which China presents the Belt and Road Initiative is that not only does it bring economic benefits, it brings greater prospects for peace and cooperation, and therefore reduces the risk of conflict. And those are the messages that China is sending. But I wonder how other countries see the situation. Dr. Sarah Ashraf, who's based at the London School of Economics, is a researcher who concentrates on challenging security environments, particularly those in the Middle East, and I'm sure that has a lot of resonance for the rest of Asia too. So I'm looking forward to hearing how she sees the Belt and Road Initiative from a stability and security perspective, and I'm particularly interested in how she regards this project as affecting the political dimension of China's relations both with Europe and with Asia. Could you please welcome Dr. Sarah Ashraf.
Okay. Yeah. See what I did there with the red? Kind of let it hang there, just for the heck of it. Make of it what you will. Okay, welcome everyone. The advantage of coming at the end is I can kind of just take everyone's points and extract the juice out of them. In this conversation today, I'm going to take you on an emotional roller coaster. I'm going to get you really excited about the prospects of the BRI, and then I'm going to rain on that parade. It sounds like I'm excited about it, I am, but a lot of it is stuff that we should be looking at, even in Europe, stuff that we should be worried about, and stuff that we should be considering through our diplomatic, political, and other channels to compel Pakistan to look at a little bit more seriously. So I will talk about CPEC. There is a lot of interest on CPEC, so I will talk about that. But I want to sort of focus on how it's got all these shifting strategic imperatives involved. First, I want to take you through just a conceptual kind of overview of what we mean by CPEC, right? Everyone's talked about it, but I think it's really important to talk about how it's less of an institutional framework and more of a strategic vision. And therein lies the technicality and the problem of trying to define the boundaries that the countries are facing, particularly countries like Pakistan. So it stretches utopia in a utopian vision from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe and Africa, 71 countries that account for half the world's population and a quarter of global GDP, and the 6 corridors that were envisioned in the first place. I hope you can see, but this kind of gives you a really good idea of the kind of proposed corridors, the ports, the railroads, the plan or under construction. These are 2015 figures, so they're slightly older, but these are what were proposed in the first place. Then we see the projects that are completed. So kind of the red ones are projects, the corridors that have got projects that are getting completed. So this is how I'm going to incorporate this discussion. We're going to talk about the scale and scope of CPEC, particularly with Pakistani reference. We're going to look at the target sectors. I'm not going to touch on technology and agriculture because when I started putting this presentation together, I realized that calls for another day of conversation, so we won't talk about that. But I do want to talk about transparency, governance, and security. Those are issues that Pakistan currently faces, and Pakistan's important not only because of CPEC, but because also it plays such a crucial role in the regional security or insecurity element, call it what you will. So this is I love this map because it's so simplified. It just tells you exactly the span of the physical road that would go up from Gwadar to Kashgar in Xinjiang. And these are the railways that we're hoping to kind of build and put together. These are the highways. And these are the special economic zones. I'll come back to the special economic zones in a little while because I think it's important. They were originally planned to be at somewhere around 42 special economic zones, but that was going to be unsustainable given Pakistan's situation, so they were whittled down to 9. There's a potential conversation of an economic zone in Gwadar, which would be the 10th, but that's kind of in conversation at the moment. So where does this concept, this buy-in to BRI come in conceptually? It comes from a project called the South-South Cooperation. It was articulated by an Argentinian economist. He was a structural economist called Raul Prebisch, who presented it at the first UN Conference for Trade and Development in 1964. The idea that South-South trade should move from the periphery and into the center. It's very attractive for people who are living in what we call the global south in academic circles. And that's something where the buy-in came in for the BRI and CPEC in particular. China started the spearheading project for the South-South cooperation, and it was very attractive for countries like Pakistan. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits, right? Why we talked about it, but I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to get you all excited and I'm going to blow it. For China, the use of Gwadar enables it to bypass the Malacca Strait, currently its only maritime route across the Middle East and Africa and Europe. It also would intend to reduce the alternative sea route distance that China currently has to traverse via the Malacca Strait by 10,000 kilometers, so it's quite a significant help to its thousands of Chinese firms that are involved in development work in the Middle East and Africa. And also then it would help open up opportunities for incentivizing state and private investment to expand employment opportunities in Xinjiang. Right, for Pakistan, CPEC carries investment, infrastructural, fiscal incentives. Pakistan's had the lowest economic growth of all the major countries in that region, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, and then and Pakistan comes at the bottom. So according to a forecast by the IMF, a previous forecast, the Pakistani GDP would have grown by more than 5% by 2020. Oh, it's a bit dicey there. According to official estimates in Pakistan, the CPEC projects may create in excess of 2.3 million jobs, and this takes us back to the conversations we were having about how many jobs for Pakistani officials are actually being created. And the country's GDP was predicted to reach 4.2 trillion by 2050. Now, those are all really exciting prospects, and to put it simply, the success of CPEC would be critical for the projection, the negotiation, the execution, and the expansion of the BRI. So let's talk about the current composition of CPEC. Gawad port is now operational for commodity exchange, financial transactions, etc. The energy sector takes the largest, let's go there. The energy sector takes the largest share of CPEC investment. That's about 72% of the total sum of $33 billion. The second largest segment of investment is dedicated for transportation. Pakistan has a very crumbling transportation network, which would be helped by CPEC in many ways, and that's very attractive for local developers, etc. And other sectors that we won't touch upon, like I said, are agriculture, which arguably is also one of critical focal points of CPEC. And it kind of gets sidelined in view of all the other high-tech stuff. But there are sort of developments there that need our attention. So, in terms of transparency, what's the problem, right? This is when it starts getting really exciting. As the project started, the short-term income increased, global domestic demand, inflated the property bubble, pushed up the value of the currency, and led to a surge in imports. As we started doing that, we started having a rising current account deficit and falling forex reserves. So the IMF started getting a little concerned about this level of Chinese debt that Pakistan was starting to stockpile. And the managing director actually said clearly that the fund will expect absolute transparency about the nature, the size, and the terms of the debt that have a bearing on a particular country, right? So what are the problems? The problems are, at the moment, even the State Bank of Pakistan does not have these details to compile its own debt sustainability forecasts on the basis of whatever information is out there. Meaning, the curator of the country's foreign exchange reserves is left to draw upon external debt sustainability forecasts on the basis of informed guesswork. This is quite stressful. And I think we should all be concerned about this, considering where Pakistan is at the scheme of things. Frequently, the payment mechanism involved in Chinese projects is not known to the State Bank, which means there's a significant underreporting of imports from China because of many of the payments that are not being routed through the country's banking system. So we want to think about if through legal covenants there are hands tied to prohibit disclosure, then surely these should also be applying to institutions like this, the IMF. If Pakistan has to disclose these to the IMF, it has to disclose it to the general public and to the State Bank. So where is this, let's get an example, okay? Why is there a huge jump in the size and suddenness of this discrepancy? A large share of this is going to the surge in import of power generation machinery, which is being recorded by customs, but is not fully visible in import financing data available, particularly with the State Bank. So it appears that the power generation machinery is landing at the port, but the corresponding outgoing payments for this machinery can't be seen. Either the payments will be due much later, or the companies responsible for the projects are simply making the payments directly in China, or after taking a loan from the Chinese banks. So it appears that the bulk of these imports are being financed from outside the Pakistani banking channel. So if the settlement for such imports is being made outside the system, what does that imply for investments that the country is supposed to see from China itself? These are questions that need to be asked at this point. This is also problematic because the outflows on debt servicing will go from the Pakistani channels, but the inflows are not being routed through it. So if the imports, the FDI, and loans from China are not fully captured in the balance of payments data, it doesn't reflect a comprehensive economic picture. We have a real problem with understanding how much is coming in and going out. So what happens once these projects begin commercial operations and their debts and repatriation of dividends start going? Will that bill arrive with a big bang? And when it does, how is Pakistan going to cope with it? Pakistan's already struggling to cope with its existing investment expenditures. So another interesting thing that was happening, the level of Chinese foreign direct investment coming into the country appears to have fallen in sort of recent times, even as the project's implementation is gathering pace and large-scale machinery imports are getting going. The inflows from China as direct investments actually dropped this year by 54% compared to last year, with the bulk of decline in the power sector. So why is the power sector seeing massive amounts of Chinese activity, with projects gathering speed and momentum, with large amounts of machinery landing at the port, while imports and investment from China are either stagnant or falling rapidly? The other thing that you need to think about are the loans from China, which are rising, particularly for balance of payment support, to help pay for whatever Chinese imports are coming in. Which are then routed through the Pakistani banking system. So given this massive scale of funds involved, the State Bank of Pakistan should realistically feel a little puzzled as to why the system has not felt the stress of these payments at the moment. And when that stress hits, what is it going to do about it? And this is where I just want to highlight that problem, that worry of debt distress that we must keep in mind, keeping Pakistan as a case in point or as a case study to how CPEC can affect a developing country in that particular state. In terms of governance, now this is going to be something that keeps coming up because Pakistan has huge internal problems of governance, of social cohesion, of polarization on so many levels, but socio-economic above a lot of others, in my opinion. So the governments tried to work on this in some way. Now remember, we keep having governments that keep shifting and changing their imperatives. So we've had different positions taken by different political parties. We had something called, the root controversy. Now, one thing that I wanted to sort of highlight, governance is a problematic topic, and as an academic, I like defining things sometimes. So here we're talking about a legal framework that envisions and ensures orderly rule within and around CPEC domains. Physical security of the corridor infrastructure, workforce, and technology is assumed here as the applied version of governance. I'm not going to even begin to try to talk about Pakistan's governance issues otherwise. So in response to the federal this, we had a root controversy. We had a party based in KPK, which demanded the route alignment to cover Pashtun areas. In Punjab, it was not so bad because the ruling party at that time, the PMLN, was engaging stakeholders in a manner where they were kind of placated. In terms of Balochistan, we do struggle. Balochistan is a province that not only struggles with a resource allocation deficit, but also with an engagement of local communities, with an engagement of local expertise, and also with the capability of executing high worth projects. So this is where we have problems. We have problems where Balochistan doesn't see direct financial benefits from the Gwadar port, a key CPEC project. Means there's local dissent, there's local unhappiness, there's local anger, and we see this in rising attacks on some of these CPEC projects, particularly if we refer back to the attack on the Chinese embassy late last year. So what do we need? We really need a dispute resolution mechanism. And I know this sounds utopian, but in this situation we really need it, because it's not only what's happening in Pakistan, it's the external drive that will drive social polarization to a greater extent into further conflict within Pakistan, and that has regional implications. We know the polarity of the borders, and we know how difficult that is when that happens. So we need to have a legal framework in place which serves as a point of reference for conflict and dispute resolution. And this is something that we need to work with, because the federal government has tried to work on a provincial and extra-regional element, but it's an sort of ambiguous notion of retributive justice with respect to allocation of CPEC profits with the regional and provincial governments. How does that work? This is even more complicated, since after the passage of the 18th constitutional amendment, technically, power has been devolved to the provinces. Technically, the provinces are free and encouraged to make demands upon the federal legislature for their due rights. So there's a challenge there that will manifest in security elements that we'll see. So what's happening? We're seeing an increased interaction of people-to-people contact from China to Pakistan. It is not reciprocal at this point, because we're seeing a lot more coming in of Chinese people than Pakistanis going to China. I've personally seen myself, every time I've visited Pakistan, there's a large number of Chinese individuals that come in, and they're not sticking to just construction projects. They are going into hairdressing, they're going into cultivation. I mean, the neighborhood hairdresser speaks fluent Urdu, and she's Chinese. They only arrived 3 years ago. So they're very, very good at picking up the local language and business opportunities. The problem comes in when they're not very good at picking up local cultural specificities, and where the respect for local cultural elements does not factor. So for instance, there have been issues, and Pakistan has had issues where there's Chinese individuals involved in security breaches. There have been reports of individuals involved in financial crimes, such as ATM skimming. Some cases remain under investigation. There have been, in April 2018, a number of Chinese workers were filmed assaulting some personnel of the Punjab Police Force, and the video footage of this went viral on social media. Again, on a people-to-people level, this is problematic on many levels. 5 Chinese workers, I know it's not much, but they were declared persona non grata due to, and now this is the interesting part, this is where there was non-compliance because they wanted to work at odd hours, extra shifts in the evenings or at night, for which the police were not, as per official policy, ready to provide security. So this is where the working conditions are also different, and they must be respected in some ways.
Sarah, just a couple more minutes.
Yep, sure.
Mind, please.
Yep. Okay, so I was going to wrap up with an idea of how the Pakistani security system has taken place. Dr. Hoodboy mentioned the military or military sort of support. But in terms of applied security, Pakistani authorities have taken due measures. They established the Special Securities Division and Maritime Force. In provincial governments, we've got the protection units comprising mostly police and numbering around 10,000 for the security of CPEC projects, Chinese labor and machinery. In the end, what I wanted to look at was take a step back. So we've developed, this whole idea of huge problems with balance of payments, with Pakistan as a developing country suffering, and potentially a bubble that's a ticking time bomb that's going to happen. So what are the implications or opportunities for Europe? This is where I believe that Europe, or UK included, can utilize one of its key roles as a strategic distribution center. It can learn, or it must learn, how to compete with our own products in equal conditions, because BRI is here to stay. It is not going to go away. So it's something that we need to learn how to adapt to and evolve with. We do need to calibrate the implications for European security and strategic interests with the changing imperatives of CPEC in particular, with the Afghan peace process, for instance, that's coming up. We need to think about how to positively engage in this space with the current developments. And in the end, we need to think about how to foment the creation and preservation of jobs in Europe following these acquisitions by Chinese companies. It's already been mentioned how deeply they've been ingrained. So we need to start thinking about how to foment these acquisitions, or how to basically mitigate their divisive effects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. And that little story about the hairdresser that crossed the border and learned Urdu in 3 years is a reminder, I think, of two of the characteristics about Chinese people which I greatly admire. Their sense of adventure and their great enthusiasm to learn new things, including other languages. I hope we haven't lost sight of the bravery of the Chinese in developing these BRI projects throughout Asia and the world. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'd be interested to hear what you've got to ask the panel, particularly in the relation to way in which the lessons that are being learned in Pakistan could be applied in the rest of Asia and other parts of the world. So let me invite you to take questions. I think what I'll do, as we're a little bit short for time, I'll take them in groups of 3 to start with. Can I start with the lady near the front there who's got glasses? Thank you very much.
I'm Aisha Siddiqa. Just a couple of very quick questions. First is that none of you spoke about UAE and Saudi Arabia's partnership with Pakistan and how does it impact relationship with China? How is China reacting to it? Second quick question is, Andrew, you talked about BRI version 2 or version 3. Now, I'm interested to know, because you did not really, none of you really spoke about the impact that Chinese presence has on local politics. And what I mean is that there has been, since CPEC, since 2013, there has been such authoritarianism added to Pakistan's existing political culture, which was not existent before. I mean, today's Pakistan seems to be worse than Ziaul Haq's Pakistan.
Okay, let's leave it there. The point is the influence of the Chinese on the political situation. Let's keep it going, because we haven't got all that much time. I'd like to just move on to another question, if I can. The gentleman with the beard, about halfway down on the left-hand side, please, has got his hand up. Just wearing a suit there. There. That's right. Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Hakim Baloch. I'm representing Baloch National Movement, party from Balochistan, struggling for the self-determination of Balochistan. I would like to thank the Democracy Forum and especially Dr. Pervez Hudbhai and Sarah Ashraf. Being Pakistani, they have presented such a great statement. But apart from that, there are some things which I need to mention. There are forced migration taking place in Balochistan from where the CPEC route is going on. There are recorded around 200,000 forced migration in last couple of years. Apart from there's a huge media blackout. Because of that, we never heard these news locally or internationally. And Doctor said about the consent of the people. Yeah, they're not asked Baloch people, but the problem is Gwadar, which is the strategic location. People have no drinking water. Okay. They have been protesting for last 2-3 months. So that's all. Thank you very much.
No, I think that's a good point. What are the implications for the people who are living in the areas of development? We've touched on that a little bit in terms of the environment. We might be able to go into that one. I'll take one little bit further, right at the back. There's a person there, right at the very, very back, with his arm up in the air, wearing a blue sweater. Can I take his third question, please? Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Good afternoon. Just a matter of fact and clarity as far as coal in Pakistan, as being one of the pioneers in Thar coal for the last 11 years, there's a tremendous amount of data and knowledge on that and transparency that you can certainly be in touch with me on that. Coal represents less than 1% of the country's energy mix. It's an integral part of the country's strategic mix for the next years to come. It doesn't matter who's in government. It's not a substitute, but a import substitution as far as oil and gas is concerned, because it's depleting.
Right.
Number one.
So it's a question about energy policy, is it?
Partly, but I'd like to clarify one thing, if I may, please.
We're quite short for time, so I don't really want to take more data at this point.
Yeah.
I'm looking for clarification on
Clarification, because there have been misleading and misconstrued and misrepresented comments being made at the panel, and that needs clarification.
Okay, all right, well, thank you very much. In the next round of questions, I'd like to open it up so we hear beyond just the Pakistan perspective, actually, but also to the rest of Asia, as I mentioned, particularly perhaps to India. But I think that one of the themes that came out of that question is, what influence does the Chinese Communist Party have over the politics of Pakistan? And then the second question is, what are the implications for the people on the ground? They haven't, in many ways, really had the information, as you said. Have they been consulted? What are the implications for them? Is it just social development goes with economic development? What's the implication? I'll start with you, Pervez. Well, Pervez, I think, might be maybe the best person to start on that.
Well, the Chinese say this is not our problem, this is your problem. You handle things the way you want. All we are concerned with is we will give you this technology, we'll build these roads for you, we'll give it on these terms, and then how you handle it is not our business. So what this ends up with in a situation like ours is that it reinforces authoritarianism, regional differences, and disaffection, particularly in Balochistan, because after all, Gwadar is situated in Balochistan, and as the gentleman pointed out, there's serious problems that have come about as a result of constructing that port, most particularly the exclusion of the Baloch from a large area, from the city, from the town itself, and from the use of water. Now, water is a very scarce resource over there, and although there were ideas about having a water filtration plant and using seawater for that, but that hasn't worked out. Let me come to the issue that Aisha Siddiqa raised. What has been the implication of Saudi Arabia now promising to invest $12 billion in Balochistan? That and the UAE as well. Now here there's talk of a Saudi economic corridor, not just Saudi-Pak economic corridor. And the Chinese are worried about that because they essentially went into the construction of Gwadar port assuming that they would have total control of that, but now they see that they could in the future get wrapped up in a struggle with Iran. Because after all, the reason that Saudi Arabia is investing in Gwadar is because it's just on the, it borders essentially Iran itself. And there's a lot of reports that I've read that the Saudis are investing in madrasas in Balochistan, and so using the Sunni religious card to balance Iran. This could lead to radicalization, and radicalization is already there, and China is afraid of that because of its own problems with the Uyghur in Xinjiang. So that leads to a complicated situation. Maybe this is the reason why China has not agreed to bail out Pakistan, and Pakistan has had to approach the IMF for the nth time.
Shall I move around the panel?
Yeah.
Andrew, I know you were talking to a Pakistani politician the other day. They were about to talk about China with you, and the conversation was suddenly cut short. Tell us what happened.
Oh no, I'm not going to go into that anecdote. But I will.
That was rather a good story there.
The Razak Dawood. Two points, though one of them is precisely on this issue, and it's a response to Aisha Siddiqa's question, which is, I mean, first of all, briefly the UAE-Saudi question. I mean, I think for all the talk of China and Pakistan in the last period of time, I think there's a fair chance you will see more investment in large infrastructure projects from Saudi Arabia in the next few years than from China. I think the total sums of money from the Gulf that are coming in may be larger. It is clearly the case that more sums of financing have come in on the immediate balance of payments issues, but I think I think lots of the Chinese big infrastructure investment is finished. There are a limited number of cases where it is still expected that these projects are going to come through. There are the existing projects, but virtually nothing new has been agreed since November 2017. The big new projects that are being proposed are as much coming from the Saudi side now. How comfortable is China about this? I mean, China has been concerned at the slow pace on Gwadar. It's been not moved very quickly in the last few years. I mean, the push on CPEC in the last few years was get the energy projects done. That had a particular political imperative behind it. At the moment, China wants the Gwadar stuff wrapped up. There would be some benefits to having additional outside investors in Gwadar, but particularly the way it's been handled with the Saudis on this, I think the Chinese have been somewhat nervous for the reasons outlined. The Saudi-Iranian balance is something that they're acutely concerned about. The military dimension on this, I think, is important. The Chinese were not, I think, happy with what played out with Nawaz Sharif. I don't think this was something they encouraged. They liked the PMLN. They liked lots of the people they were dealing with in the last government. What you are seeing a bit already, when we're talking about transparency issues, when we're talking about civil military issues, when we're talking about authoritarianism, I mean, you are seeing the Chinese root more around the civilian government now and try and fix more things directly with the army. You only need to look at the early statements that came out from the PTI government, and then the backdooring that then went on, back-channeling to the army chief. You have this great, the day you have Razak Dawood's interview in the FT, the next day you have Chinese ambassador appears in a picture with the army chief. Various ministers are now told to shut up about these things. I can go into the implications of this more, but I'll let.
Thank you, Andrew. We've only got a few minutes left, and what I really want to do is to try to open this out more internationally, because we've had quite a close focus on the situation in Pakistan, which is entirely appropriate. But of course, we are talking about Belt and Road internationally. So if you've got a question about its implications from India or something internationally, that would be very welcome. I'm going to start about halfway back. The gentleman with the yellow turban, please. Can I have your question, please?
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum.
Can you turn it on? Please turn it on.
Ram Rahim, Manohar Iqbal, Chan, David Singh. That's my full name. I've got 78 own different nationalities. So I've got joined together. I was not well, so I insisted I have to come here because my heart is always here. My wife told me don't come, my son told me don't go. And then in the end, my son said, you're half mad. Today you're doing your full mad. The point which I want to make is, I don't like what China is doing, as you don't like. But I was a teenager when Showing Life, came to India. And my throat became hoarse when I was saying, Indigene bye bye, indigene bye bye. Right? And all the Indians and the Chinese, we are friends. And lo and behold, sir, within 6 months, we were attacked by China. Because India hosted, out of pity and sympathy, the Dalai Lama. Point which I'm making is, sir, that Britishers, other countries, went to colonize places. Right? They plundered and robbed the Indian subcontinent. Right? They virtually killed the skills, of the people and left them totally poor, destitute, and ignorant.
Okay.
Politics, sir.
I think you've made.
Let me just finish that, sir.
I think you've reminded us of a sad period in Asian history.
We have to talk openly and honestly.
Yes,
and look at
our Q&A session may not be the right environment in which to do so.
Give me 2 minutes.
You give me 2 minutes.
Well, I don't think we have really got another 2 minutes. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think you've reminded us of a painful period in Asian history, and I think it is relevant. But let's see whether we've got something that particularly relates to the topic of the conference, Belt and Road Initiative, implications for the rest of Asia, especially India. A question, please. Gentleman there in the blue shirt, halfway down. Could I ask you to bring us back into focus? In the middle of the corridor there, on the aisle. Thank you.
My question is about the country which has not been discussed, is Burma. What do you think is the role of Chinese investment in the Rohingya crisis and a possible implication of a similar crisis in Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm not going to take a question about the Rohingya crisis in Burma, but I will say there is a copy of Asian Affairs around on your table with an article about the Rohingya crisis on the front cover, which I wrote a couple of weeks ago. And I'd be very happy to discuss the Rohingya crisis with you in some detail, and the implications of the Chinese-Myanmar relationship is very, very interesting, but it's not the subject of today's conference, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. The lady there with with her hand up there in the black top, please.
Thank you so much for a very, very enlightening discussion. My question is to Andrew Small. Andrew, I've always admired your work on China, Pakistan, actually, but I'm not going to pick up on that because that's not what we are supposed to focus on. None of the panelists actually mentioned the Communist Party, China, and obviously President Xi, really focusing a lot on Chinese export of Chinese soft power. And that also, that includes a lot of Confucius Institutes, not only in South Asia, Iran, Pakistan, everywhere, but also in Europe. A promotion of Mandarin as a language, as a business language. Also, basically, the export of the mobile business. Technologically, because I'm a person who has been looking into media, global media, for a very long time. So technologically, they are going to be a force to be reckoned with, and how do you see China actually taking a stance on that? Thank you.
I think that's nice. I think that widens it out nicely. And actually, the other one you could add to the list is the use of the renminbi as a currency for international business too. Interesting. So, Sarah, the question really is about the influence of China, again, not just in terms of investment and actually moving beyond whether it's directly influencing the politics of any individual country, Pakistan or Sri Lanka or the Maldives or whatever, but its growing role through soft power and other ways of telling the Chinese story according to its own terms. Sorry, we'll share the microphone.
Thank you. I think the question about digital technology is really important. I think Pakistan has particularly, I'm going to branch it out a little bit after this, but in Pakistan there are companies with the brand name Zong, there's Huawei, there's ZTE corporations, which employ, for instance, ZTE employs more than 220 Chinese staff and over 620 local employees with 85 local stakeholders. Huawei holds the largest share of communications equipment, 45%, and cooperates with 5 major domestic operators in Pakistan, has training centers as well there. So there is, and these are just a couple of examples. We're not even looking at the fiber optic network, we're not looking at surveillance, we're not looking at other sort of technologies. I have a whole couple of pages on that, which I won't talk about now. But there are things that we need to think about, particularly when it comes to ideas of security and strategy. In terms of soft power, I think we need to go back to looking at where Pakistan is at the moment. You've got the Afghan peace process happening. You've got a potential exit of the US, again, from the region, leaving a whole host of issues unresolved. I mean, we can say they're resolved, but you know, the Taliban control currently 55% of Afghan territory, so we need to worry about that. We also do need to think about the Saudi influence and how that played out the last time Pakistan had Saudi influence during the Afghan war. So some of those things are important, but one of the ways to look at CPEC, particularly in BRI in general, is this assertion of soft power with the sort of dilution of US power. And this is where this balance, and Europe needs to kind of step in as a stepping stone to mitigate that process.
Thank you, Sarah. A huge other topic, really, which is China-US rivalry, which we haven't touched on. Pervez.
The soft power question. I think the effect is minimal in Pakistan, and that's because there's a huge cultural barrier. We don't speak Chinese, and that makes a lot of difference. Yes, there is an FM radio channel. I turn it on when I drive to work, and they try and teach Chinese language, easy steps to learning Chinese. As far as I can't make out anything from it, frankly. And I've asked people if they've seen any progress in that direction. The answer is no. So what happens is that on this channel, which has been purchased by China, they play American songs.
Thank you. Andrew, the last word to you.
Please, Andrew, not just restricted to Pakistan.
Yeah. Yes, and thanks for the kind comments as well. I mean, I think the question is what the purpose of the soft power activities is and how efficacious they are. In some of the cases, yes, there are places where the aim is, with some of these activities, to reach a small segment of elites. If we were to do the Pakistani case, it has been the broadening out between a really small number of people in the political and security establishment to a somewhat wider pool of people, if not necessarily reaching the population as a whole. If you're going to look at opinion poll ratings for China and Pakistan, I think they're going to go down in the next period of time. I mean, China's always been above 80% and things there. I think public opinion more broadly will have shifted in the last few years, but there is a broader elite that one tries to reach through these efforts, and I think there has been a more effective co-opting of a wider group in Pakistan than was the case before. I think that, in some cases, is a lot of the purpose of the soft power activities in various places, not necessarily, because I think you can go around in a number of countries and say, look, opinion poll ratings on China are not so hot. I mean, there's in some cases been deterioration in the last period of time, but some of these things are more directed at this kind of small subset, and I think lots of those activities have been more effective and successful in the last period of time, even if they're not always felt tangibly by everyone listening to their radios.
Thank you, Andrew. No, I think that's a very fair point. I think public opinion is shifting in Asia and in many other parts of the world. China is getting noisier, it's getting more assertive, but also the noise about China and the analysis of China is becoming sharper and broader. And I think we've seen a lot of that today, and I hope we'll be able to continue the conversations over drinks and nibbles in a moment. Now, some conferences end with a bit of a damp squib. That's never true of Democracy Forum events. We always finish on a high note when we have our next speaker, Barry Gardner, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. I know that he's been listening carefully to what all the different delegates and participants and speakers have been saying over the last couple of hours. Barry, can I ask you to come and give us your thoughts to close?
He says I have to go around that way, but actually if I speak like this, do I need a microphone? At the back, can you hear me? Okay, I'd rather not, because otherwise I'll never, I mean, look at this mess. I did love, I'm going to start in the middle, right? Because I love listening to Pervez Hooghoi. He's like a skepticism indicator with charm. And of course he took us back to the East India Company College, the honourable, as he reminded us, East India Company College. And, you know, around the dome of the East India Company College, I believe the quotation is as follows: "My sword and shield I leave to him who can get them. My marks and scars I carry with me to bear witness that I have served him who shall now be my rewarder." Okay? You took us back 100 years. And you talked about the Enlightenment values and how the way in which the Chinese values are not Enlightenment values, but we think Enlightenment values are universal. We have a very particular perspective. And these were profound questions about the way in which we perceive ourselves and the way in which we perceive the other. And you talked about the consequences of globalization and the way in which this is seen in different parts of the world in very different ways. Of course, you talked about the lack of transparency, and that's a theme that's been running through all that we've discussed this afternoon, and we'll come to that. But I think what I found most challenging about what you said was when you prompted us to think about what sustainable development means. And one of the clear pushbacks that so many in the panel talked about comes down to that element of, is this development sustainable? And you took it in a very particular direction. You talked about water resource, you talked about pollution from coal emissions, the nuclear plants in Karachi. You didn't mention, I don't think, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which all of our countries at the United Nations have committed to. And one, I think, of the key challenges that we need to be looking at is how the BRI fits in with the Sustainable Development Goals and what it's doing to challenge the previous models of development. From there, I want to go to what Teresa Fallon said. And you talked about how it stands for an attempt to establish a comprehensive program to shape the world in China's interest, or in Chinese interests. And again, you talked about Europe not being able to compete in Africa because of the strings attached. And that made me jump down to what Andrew was saying about what we should do, because there's a real tension here. I mean, it seemed to me that, I know you had this lovely American accent, but, there was a sense of ressentiment in that American accent. Bloody hell, the Chinese are doing imperialism better than we have. And that's just not right. I mean, we might have done it with Coca-Cola, they're doing it with Belt and Road. And that sense of just, I mean, if you were English, you'd have said, they're not playing cricket. But Andrew sort of said, well, what should we be doing about this? How should we be trying to compete? And he talked about stiffening the sinews. Transparency, again, transparency coming up over and over and over again in what everybody was talking about. Integrated overview of fiscal and debt risk. Engage on standards, engage on transparency. But and of course, in amongst all of that was the talk about corruption. And you can't get away from that. But then you have to look back at ourselves. And you have to remember, we're sitting here in a city, in a country, for which every dollar, I know we have 30 pounds, but for every dollar in aid that we give, $5 comes back in laundered money into this city. That's the reality of what's going on. So when we talk about transparency, when we talk about, corruption and stiffening the sinews, well, we've a few sinews of our own that we need to stiffen. I told you this was a mess. Sarah, again, transparency, target sectors, governance. The State Bank cannot create its own debt sustainability forecast. I mean, that is just staggering, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about sovereignty. We're talking about sovereignty. If your own state bank cannot create its own debt sustainability forecast, I mean, you're screwed, aren't you?
It is a mess.
It
is absolute mess.
This invisibility of the financial flows. And then you go to, and I think you said this and not me, but the way I wrote this, I'm not sure. So forgive me if I'm putting my words into your mouth. I didn't mean to. But the delayed impact of debt distress. Your words, yeah?
Yes, my words.
Okay. The delayed impact of debt distress. And here I'm going to diverge for a minute, I think, into what Andrew was talking about. Because, I mean, you gave us some real, I mean, it just kept motoring, didn't it, what he said? And you talked about externalize China's internal approach, how it was doing the model of development that had gone on domestically and taking that out, and that belief that infrastructure creates development, and if there's problems with it, okay, well, that's just part of what development's about. And it reminded me of that Chinese phrase, first build roads. First build roads. And that is, I think, very much China's view of how you do development. It's about infrastructure. And there's so much I wanted to pick up, Andrew, from what you said about readjustment and the way that the scale is reduced, mitigation of the more onerous contract terms and debt rescheduling, all of that. But the thing that I really wanted to pick out was the trouble with roads. There's a problem with roads. If you first build roads, the problem with roads is that traffic goes both ways. And yes, you go out on that road and you have your, what did you call it, soft cultural, you know. But what you also have is you have the traffic that comes back to you. And all of that pushback is the traffic that is coming back. Now, it's coming back into a China that is markedly different from the China of a few years ago. The way in which President Xi has taken and centralized, really in the persona of the president, power within China, means that the questions now that are coming back along those roads, can be destabilizing of the political hegemony in Beijing. And that is a potential instability that we should all be aware of. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying we need to know the potential is there. It's that, what might be called feedback loop. And that can feed internal criticism. So Did I miss that bit out? I probably did, but I've probably spoken for too long anyway. Catherine, is Catherine still here? No. Sad. When she spoke of the CICC, the Chinese International Commercial Court, that being part of the pushback, and spoke of how do we create a court that shows BRI partners our serious legal intent. And one of the big issues, it seems to me, in international commerce and international diplomacy at the moment is around these international court structures. Because what we're seeing in the WTO, with the refusal of America to allow the nominations or the appointments to the appellate court there, we're seeing an undermining of capacity in the multilateral-based global order to actually function properly. What we're also seeing in terms of international trade agreements, and New Zealand, I think, is the latest one of these, where New Zealand has now said, we will not be bound by the ISDS procedures, the international, the investor-state dispute settlement procedures that exist within the Pacific Partnership, CTP, CCTT, I can't remember the letters. And the way in which we adjudicate these international disputes now is really at a very, very difficult point for international affairs. So where does it leave us? We've got huge amounts of intellectual stimulation this afternoon. But I really like the points that Sarah put up on the board at the end about where Europe can be in all of this and how we should be responding. In particular, learn how to compete with our own products on equal conditions. The most pertinent question of the afternoon was asked by Humphrey Hawksley. And let me try and quote it properly. He said, these countries need infrastructure. Are we able to respond with the same verve and imagination, of BRI? Or has the West failed to offer that? I think the answer is absolutely clear. Yes, we have, and we need to step up to the game.
Thank you very much, Barry. As you said, we've had lots of intellectual stimulation today, and I loved your idea about the questions come back down along the road, along the Belton Road. Many questions raised, and great to have so many different perspectives. Thank you very much indeed for coming to join us for today's conference, and thank you very much indeed for the University of London and the Commonwealth Institute for hosting today's event. I hope you'll join us now for a few minutes of drinks and further conversation in the lobby. Thank you very much for all your attention today.
That's John Hemmings.
Oh, do you want me to call him?
He has disappeared because he wasn't very well.
I'll send him a message.